From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters.
As Canadians know, this is a moment where we're going to be taking decisions that will last not just for the coming months, but for the coming decades. And Canadians deserve their say.
The writ has dropped. The Canadian federal election campaign begins now. This election is undoubtedly different from any we've ever seen before. The question remains the same, but the stakes seem so much higher this time, set against the backdrop of a pandemic. What do Canadians want? Joining us on This Matters, Susan Delacourt, national columnist for the Toronto Star, who often covers the Liberal Party, and Alex Boutilier, national politics reporter for the Toronto Star, who covers the Conservative Party. We'll get you set up with everything you need to know heading into this pivotal election, the big issues, talking points, and a party-by-party breakdown. Susan, Alex, thanks for joining us. Great to have you both here.
Great to be here.
Good to be here, thanks.
36 days to Election Day. This is a snap election, years ahead of when it was scheduled for. But Susan, Alex, an election this fall, was this the worst kept secret on the Hill? Susan, I'll start with you first.
Yeah, very definitely. I think everybody had an evolving sense over the past couple of weeks. It's funny, there's always a time in Ottawa where suddenly you realize it's like it's in the air that an election is inevitable. And for me, that was about 2 weeks ago. Suddenly, you just started planning for the idea that the rest of the summer was going to be devoted to an election. And I don't know whether it's a memo, though, that goes out telepathically in the city, but it just was, yeah, we're having an election.
Yeah. When did it crystallize for you, Alex?
We are a town that's known for its groupthink, so I think telepathic messaging is probably accurate. I would say, yeah, about midsummer, it seemed like it was becoming inevitable. You mentioned that, it's a few years ahead of schedule, but there's a shelf life for a minority parliament. It's usually around 2 years. We're coming up on that point now. So I don't think that it's terribly surprising that Canadians are going to have a choice at the polls next month. It's been coming for a while.
And what about the timing? I know many Canadians are questioning that. There's a few things going on here. It's the pandemic, but also it's, again, slightly earlier. We weren't sure when it was going to happen, but is there something curious about the timing of this election?
You know what I've been thinking about is politically, it's not a surprise. And it is not a shocking thing to say in politics that a governing minority wants to become a majority. Although I wasn't around to cover Pierre Trudeau, the same thing happened to him. He won a huge Trudeau-mania election, lost a minority in 1972, governed for 2 years and came back with a majority. Though Justin Trudeau doesn't always want to walk in his father's footsteps, this one he does. But the example I'm thinking of is Stephen Harper, who was pretty blatant about the idea that he wanted to turn his, Alex will remember this, we heard for many, many days, strong, stable, conservative majority government. That was the 2011 campaign, and that's what Stephen Harper got. So there's sort of a sense of, I'm shocked to find out there's gambling going on here and that the Prime Minister wants to turn his minority into a majority. That's kind of the goal of politics, is to win. So I don't want to sound like I'm cynical about this. I think there are legitimate concerns being raised about the fact that we are in the middle of a pandemic. But the United States managed to have an election in a worse phase of the pandemic. Several provinces had two. Alex is right. 2 years is about at the outside for a minority government. So I think those concerns are going to sort of fade as the days go on.
The one thing I would say there is, there are always variables in election campaigns. There's always events that, throw the best laid plans of political parties off course. The fourth wave and the Delta variant is one heck of a variable. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting and potentially very concerning to see how, the virus that we've lived with for the last 18 months evolves and impacts this campaign. It's something that we've literally never experienced before. So that's something that's going to be quite interesting to watch.
Right. So in many ways, this is sort of a first election. I know you've both covered many campaigns, but this is a different one. We're talking about a different beast here. It may look very different than what we're used to.
I'd say so, yeah. Pandemic election is, what has not been different the last 17 months? But yeah, although the tours go ahead. I was talking to some friends aboard the campaign planes today. That beast marches on. So the reporters are out in the road saying that yesterday when we got to Rideau Hall, I saw this little lineup of little brown bags with reporters' names on them. And I thought, isn't that nice? The Liberals are giving loot bags to reporters on day one, but they were rapid COVID tests. And it was for everybody who was going to be getting on the plane with them.
Yeah, and you get a PCR test, and you get a PCR test, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, how nice. You shouldn't have. Yeah, so I've never seen that aboard a campaign plane before.
Yeah, and I would say too, I mean, the leader of the opposition yesterday launched his campaign from a hotel suite, right? And, is going to be doing a lot of campaigning in front of a virtual screen. I mean, I think this election is going to look very different than general elections of the past. But as Susan mentioned, political parties are still going to be getting out there. Reporters are still going to be following them as they sort of tour the country to meet Canadians. But certainly, we've never had an election quite like this one.
So let's talk about the major parties then. We'll do a preview of each of them. We'll start with the Liberal Party. We talked about Trudeau pushing for a majority government here. Are they in good shape to remain in control here? How do they sell their accomplishments, you think, leading into a pandemic? Susan?
I would say very, very carefully. I do not think this is the time for Liberals to be overconfident. I think that while it's only 15 seats, in 2019, there were 15 seats away from a majority. That's a lot of seats to pick up in a tight world. And we see that the Liberals have been in power a long time, and familiarity breeds contempt sometimes. And Justin Trudeau has been in people's faces for 17 months, although he had a different face. He had the beard. So I would expect to see the Liberals, they will be trying to make it a little bit of a referendum on how they handled the pandemic. But I keep going back to Winston Churchill. And also, I was not around to cover that. I wasn't alive. But Winston Churchill was probably the best crisis leader that the 20th century ever saw. And the first available opportunity, the British voters kicked him from office. He was tossed out. I know that Trudeau and his team are mindful of that. The explanation was, the best explanation, I guess, I did an essay on this in university, really, was that British voters didn't want to be reminded of the hellish past few years. They wanted a plan for the future. And I think the Prime Minister can't go in sort of saying, we had your backs. He's got to go in there and say, here's what we're going to do to get out of it. And Aaron O'Toole, Alex knows this better than most, is going to try very much the same thing. So is Jagmeet Singh. So this is a party with a past that somehow has to campaign for the future.
And specifically for Trudeau, potentially he could be winning 3 successive elections here. There's not many PMs that have done that. Does he care about that at all? Do you think that a third mandate changes the way he governs?
Yes, I think he cares very much. He is a very competitive person. Stephen Harper and Jean Chrétien won 3 terms. So definitely, I don't know that he'll want to beat that. And his own father won 3 or 4. So I think he does care about that. He does want to stay in office. I think there were some suggestions that he wanted to leave. People I think who didn't know him very well were sort of saying, looks like the fun's gone out of this job for him. This guy wants to stay in office. I don't think people appreciate how much he changed between term 1 and term 2. And I don't know that, the changing won't stop. He's going to be a different guy if he gets a third term. But yes, he and the fact that he did transform his leadership and management style so much, not just because of the pandemic, is evidence that he really wants to hang on.
And whatever you think of the guy, if he wins a third term, he cements his legacy as one of the most successful prime ministers in Canadian history, frankly, bringing the Liberal Party back from, death's door in 2015 to 3 terms in office, I think would be quite an accomplishment, whatever you think about the guy. To get back to something that Susan was saying, though, in terms of the pandemic management and whether or not this election will be a referendum on it, I was speaking to David Coletto, the head of Abacus Data, and he mentioned that, the best thing for the Liberals is that the pandemic management is not an issue in this election. In other words, if they had really fumbled it, if they had really mismanaged the early days of the pandemic, it would probably be a factor in this election in the negative category for them. So, in a sense, the best that they could hope for is that they got voters through the pandemic well enough that it's not going to be a negative for them. And I think elections are always about choices on the future, right? Just like editors, voters say, what have you done for me lately? So I think that, when people go to the ballot box, it won't be about the last 18 months. It'll be about the next 4 years or 2 years.
We'll be right back. So even though that we've used this word so many times, but an unprecedented challenge and a crisis, they can't lean perhaps too much on that. They can't talk about the past too much, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think people are very hungry for a hopeful vision of the future after the last 18 months that we just experienced, and some concrete plans for how Canada is going to be different after we crawl out of the hole that we've been in this pandemic.
So let's turn our attention to the Conservatives. They will be making that pitch that they are the future. Alex, how do you feel that the timing of the election affects their game plan? Are they ready for this?
I think they're as ready as they're going to be. I know that the people close to Aaron O'Toole have been planning and expecting a snap election basically since he was elected Conservative leader last August. They had a sense very early that they didn't have any time to lose in order to, get the Conservative Party ready to fight an election. Whether that'll be enough, I'm not sure. They're currently, somewhat consumed with debates within their party, let alone debates with other parties. Some people in caucus, some people, who are sort of senior strategists in the Conservative movement are not terribly happy with the direction that Aaron O'Toole and his team are taking this party. And so, they're kind of fighting two battles at once. They're trying to make their case and introduce Aaron O'Toole to the Canadian public. At the same time, everybody is not really rowing in the same direction within the party.
Mm-hmm. So internal, there's some conflict there too, but, making that pitch to the public, a lot has been made about the public opinion polls. What did they say about Aaron O'Toole, especially perhaps to that vital 905 region of the GTA? How popular is he? Do Canadians know who he is yet?
No, I don't think that they do. And interestingly enough, the public polling that we've had access to over the last year and a half has suggested that people don't terribly like Aaron O'Toole, even if they don't know who Aaron O'Toole really is. I'm kind of at a loss. It's always sort of puzzled me as to why his negatives are so high among Canadian voters, while people really don't seem to have a good grasp of who he is and what he represents. He's going to have to rectify that over the course of this campaign. He'll have plenty of opportunities to get in front of our readers' eyeballs, get on TV, get on the radio, get his message across. He really has to make no mistakes over the next 36 days if they have a chance of pulling this out.
And what do you think their strategy is? What will they be selling people on? I know we talked about the future, but what will they harp on, you think?
It's too bad we're recording this in the morning because his platform is being released in a couple hours. But I think that, without any advanced knowledge, I think that they're going to really push this angle of securing the recovery, secure. That's been in all of their literature and all of their sort of ads so far. I think that he's really going to sort of play to voters' anxiety and concern for the future that's been sort of exacerbated by the pandemic and what we've all just gone through. And I think the economy is going to be a major thing. They're going to suggest that, only they can rebuild the economy after the pandemic to make Canada more competitive and more prepared for, frankly, another catastrophic event like this.
So let's turn our attention to the NDP, right? When we're talking about popularity, again, we reference those polls again. Jagmeet Singh's popularity is quite high in these early polls, but can that translate into seats? Beyond being the fourth party again. Susan, what do you think? Will that popularity turn into more votes this time around?
I'm watching this really carefully because it is interesting how much his esteem has risen between campaigns. He has definitely done something right. That's what all the polls are showing too. Somebody really smart said to me a couple of weeks ago, it was a Liberal, said that Liberals are watching it too, of course, that he's raised his floor, but not his ceiling. That there may be a greater available pool of voters for Jagmeet Singh now, but will it translate into more seats? Is he anywhere near like an orange wave? And I think Quebec is still a problem for him. I don't know that the battle there seems to be between the Bloc and the Liberals, and it was Quebec that gave Jack Layton his orange wave. So I'm intrigued, and I don't think we should underestimate what a feel-good leader does to a campaign when Canadians are so desperate need of feeling good. So I don't rule him out. I'm going to watch him really closely. Highly recommend Alex Bowingall's profile of him in our package of coverage today. There's just so much in there. But yeah, I'm intrigued by the NDP for sure this time.
Alex, is there a realistic shot of them being the official opposition? Because especially in this minority government, they have been the most frequent dance partner with the Liberals in Parliament. Is there a chance that they can be opposition here?
Yeah, I think that there's a chance. Two major things that they have going for them are Mr. Singh's likability numbers. People really seem to identify with the guy and like the guy, which is an asset. Of course, they then have to capitalize on that with the hard work and the ground game that ends up winning seats. But the other thing the NDP have going for them is a weak Conservative Party, or at least a Conservative Party who appears weak based on the public polling that we have. I think, with the Conservatives sort of struggling to get to that 33% that they would need to be a serious threat to win the election, that gives people license to vote NDP, progressive voters license to vote NDP, because, they're not strategically voting Liberal to prevent a Conservative government. So I think, voters can feel a little bit more free to actually vote their conscience rather than voting for the most likely progressive party to form government. So I think that that's going to be an interesting dynamic to watch over the course of the race, especially if the Conservatives can't really make up that ground to make them a serious threat to form government.
And I just wanted to quickly touch on the Greens here. I know that there's a crisis in that party. Perhaps some people aren't fully aware of what's going on, but let's talk about that quickly. And then how do you think that will carry into the election? Susan, you want to take that one?
Yeah, it's been 3 months of really, really bad headlines and all self-inflicted wounds with the Green Party. There is obviously some discomfort with Annamie Paul's leadership that is playing out in wild and wacky ways. Again, shout out to Mr. Ballingall. The Star has been on top of this. And every time he would file a story for this get, I go, this can't be real. Can't be doing this before an election. Annamie Paul, who's an impressive person, but controversial, obviously, and polarizing within the Green Party, has fended off a mid-campaign challenge to her leadership. But I think enough has sort of got through to Canadians. They don't look like they have their act together. I had thought the Green breakthrough was going to take place in 2019. They dared to dream of double digits, and the NDP stole all of that from them. A little bit Liberal stealing too. That was when they were strong. They only ended up with 3 seats. I think it's been long enough that we've seen these crazy battles that at a very time when climate change and Green Party issues should be on the agenda of an election, I think they've got a mess to clean up internally over there.
Right. So never mind trying to sell to people. They got a clean house in the middle of an election.
Yeah, she did a good job yesterday launching her campaign. Lots of good things to say. She looked happy and energized. She is only going to campaign in Toronto, I read at some point. She's concentrating on getting her own seat. But, she's up against Marcy Ian in Toronto Centre. Even in the worst days of the Liberal Party, that seat belonged. There's been some redistribution, but that geography belongs to the Liberal Party. So uphill battle all the way around.
Yeah, and I would say that it takes a lot of work to run a successful election campaign, even in one riding, let alone in 338 ridings. They have been so consumed with internal infighting over the past, 6 months that I'd be very surprised if a lot of that hard work is done or if it's going to be done on the fly during an election campaign. And I'd be very surprised to see them come out of this with more than 1 seat.
So I know you're both obviously seasoned vets on the Hill. You know your way around an election. This one will be a strange one. There's no doubt about it. So what is one thing that each of you will be watching closely for, that you're paying attention to, that you're already fascinated by? Alex, I'll go to you first.
Well, I cover the Conservative Party, so that's the world that I know the best. And, on day one of the campaign, I had Conservatives texting me talking about what a disaster this election campaign already is. If that's their feeling on day one, I'm going to be very interested to hear their feelings on day 35. So I think that that's one dynamic that I'll be watching very closely, just in terms of internal division within the Conservative Party. And the other thing I mentioned earlier, just how the pandemic continues through this election, how the Delta variant sort of takes hold in certain communities. A lot of the communities that have been hardest hit by COVID are also, coincidentally, some of the most electorally important. Peel region, Brampton, the GTA generally. And so I think that that's going to be something that all parties are going to be watching very closely as this campaign continues.
Susan?
It's going to sound really geeky, but it isn't. Federal provincial stuff, not constitutional matters. I am fascinated and have been throughout the pandemic by the relationship between Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau's Liberals. It has evolved a lot since the last campaign. I want to know how that's playing. Is there tension? Or is there some informal truce between Doug Ford and Trudeau this time? And also Jason Kenney and what's been going on in Alberta, Jason Kenney's fortunes. The provinces that had once been seen as the Conservative resistance to Justin Trudeau, and maybe instrumental in giving him that minority in 2019, seem a little bit less organized and less resisty this election. So I'm going to watch that really carefully.
So much more we could talk about here, but your work really begins for both of you with this campaign. We will definitely be turning to you both again. Susan, Alex, big thank you for joining us to talk.
Thanks for the chat.
Thanks.
And that is Susan Delacourt and Alex Boutilier, both reporting in Ottawa for the Toronto Star. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Adrian Chung. Our This Matters team is me, Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachnick, Raju Mudar, Saba Aitazaz, and Sean Pattinen. Our music is by So Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattinen. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us your comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.